like to welcome you all here tonight to this first seminar in our COVID-19 Causes and Consequences and Cures series. Tonight we're privileged to have Professor Paul Freitas of the London School of Economics with us, and he's going to take us through the trade-offs that are inherent in our treatment of this pandemic. I wish I'd been paying attention a few years ago. Paul is someone who's spent a lot of time in Queensland, in fact 16 years. He's originally from the Netherlands, but in 2001, I think it might have been, he was at the University of Melbourne doing postdoc work, then ANU, and then as a professor at QUT, and finally at the University of Queensland. He left here about 3.5 years ago to the London School of Economics. In 2009, he was recognised as Australia's top young economist under 40 years. I suspect if he was still here, he might even be recognised as Australia's top economist. The topic of his speech is the whole picture, COVID seen and unseen victims. I anticipate that Paul will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and after that we'll have a Q&A. So welcome back to Australia, so to speak, Paul.
Thank you very much. So I want to talk about 3 different things. I want to talk about some basic trade-off numbers and then bring it together, so the principle of cost-benefit analysis. Now, if we think about how to judge reactions to a pandemic, of course, first of all, you want to know how bad the pandemic could be. Right? And so you want to know, well, what if you treated it just like another disease? Because at any moment, there are sort of dozens of diseases roaming around in the human pool. And you want to, of course, know what would happen if you did all kinds of specific things. And in the public's eye now are lockdowns, track and trace, the South Korea option, the Hong Kong option, all kinds of things. And of course, that is on the disease side. You also want to know, well, what about the policy side? So you want to know about the totality of our reactions, the lockdowns itself, the government interventions, all the debts that are being made. And in order to do a good analysis, you need to have some notion of counterfactuals in mind. That's true of any choice. Well, what if I don't buy this? And what if I don't do this policy? What if we don't do this? What if we don't do that? And then you sort of whittle down the many candidates to, as it were, a few key candidates. And the obvious one would be shrug shoulders. That's sort of what we've done with most diseases the last 10 years. We sort of let the health system sort it out, but the rest of society doesn't get too involved. Or we can sort of go into what was known in the Middle Ages as the Italian reaction, which is the one that we are following now, which is this kind of extreme social distancing and lockdown. Right? So what we are doing now has a long, long ancestry, many, many centuries. Now, it's handy to bear in mind that there have been pandemics which are truly terrible, and the worst pandemic that I am aware of is that of the plague, which about half population in Europe came in various waves, and populations were totally flabbergasted. It probably came from the east as well then, and communities tried all sorts of things, including whole towns which locked themselves up. However, that didn't help much because the rats bring it in. So lockdowns were tried, but the only thing which sort of helped was to sort of run away and go and hide in the forest where there weren't too many rats. Now, there have been many, as it were, pandemics that weren't over the last 50 years. This is a hat tip to Ramesh Thakur. And they really come fast and thick. So in the 90s, you had UK mad cow disease, and I remember that was a whole hullabaloo. They thought that large parts of the population were going to eventually die or become totally demented because of this. So the European Union of Scientists suggested 500,000 people could die. By October 2013, there were only 177. It was the Asian flu of the 2000s. That was more recent. The UN coordinator said, well, maybe 5 to 150 million people could die from it. And at the moment, basically only 455 people have died of it. Then there was the swine flu fear in 2009. There was a feared 1.3% fatality rate. And you think, oh my God, the world as a whole, that's like 80 million people. But there were about 457. Right? So much less than, as it were, was feared. Let me put this one down. Okay, now let's have a quick look at the COVID death tolls, because that's sort of important to sort of see, well, what ballpark figure are we in, right? And initially there was sort of huge fear. So I know best about London. There was modeling saying, oh, 500,000 are going to die. And then a week later, 20,000. And a week later, oh, no, 6,000. and now we're up to the 2030s again. The WHO in February said, well, maybe 3 to 5% of cases. Of course, most people don't form a case. But at present, the total in the whole world is about 320,000. That's basically who die in 2 days in the world, because every day about 150, 160,000 people die, because we're almost 8 billion now. We know that those who die on average are old, have few remaining life years. We knew this in February. We now also know what the worst is. The worst is New York. That's about 0.15, which is, as it were, what would normally die in a few months. That's the absolute worst that we have, and it was sort of a laissez-faire type place because they let the virus roam around. So that is what we now think of as almost the worst case you can get in the world, a dense city. A high toll for a Western country is 0.06. That's probably what it was, roughly speaking, in Belgium, Italy, and Spain. And many countries have almost no deaths despite doing nothing much. Vietnam, the Indian countryside, Malaysia, and they think that's partly due to the air conditioning. So we can already whittle down the plague. This is not the plague, nor is it the Spanish flu, which made something like 50 million victims and hit the young much harder. You know, this is very much a disease which hits those who are already weak. And it doesn't seem to, with all the reactions we've had, but even in places that have had little reactions, come anywhere close to, as it were, the major pandemics in previous centuries. So in a do-little scenario in 2020 in February, the model is for maybe would cost 1% of the population. Now the serious model is, I think really it can't be much more than a fifth of that, even if you do almost nothing. So that gets you a ballpark figure. How bad can this thing get? Right? At the outset, one sort of knew that any policy aimed at reducing COVID deaths would maximally save 1% of lives. That's sort of what was fought in February. And much less the 1% of life years of the whole population, because it hits those people who are already fallen. So that is sort of on the side of, well, how bad can this get? Then on the side, well, what have the effects been of the whole of humanity? What's the other side? We now know that more than 100 million new unemployed have occurred in the West, probably something like 400 million worldwide. Extreme famines are now predicted for places of Africa where lots of people have lost their jobs because they're no longer supplying us with services. There's a GDP drop of 20% in the West expected now in the second quarter and elsewhere. So it's not true that this is only leading to an economic collapse of us. The stock markets in India have gone down the same. As I said, Africa is in dire straits. There's a feared famine, which has now been projected to cost something like 300,000 people per day in the coming 2 months by the World Food Organization. And loss of inoculations of measles and tuberculosis is also predicted to cost millions if it keeps on going. There have been civil wars. There's been one brewing in Lebanon. In India, there have been major riots of the Muslims. Parts of Africa also. That's what you get, of course, if you're close to starvation. There's mass loneliness and lockdown territories. That could be up to 4 billion of the world population. We know that in the West alone, there are 20,000 prevented IVF babies per month in the West, and the same again elsewhere. And those babies, of course, would otherwise live in 80 years. There's reduced usage of health services. The hospitals are rather empty because people don't dare go there. And for instance, the cancer physicians have said, look, this is killing lots and lots of people. And there's been disrupted education of maybe up to 1 billion people around the world, the children, and that, of course, will have long-run consequences. So that gets you the ballpark figure of, okay, well, on the one hand, the potential cost of the pandemic through lives lost, and now this has already been the cost of our reactions. If we then think, well, some of these are global effects and some of these are local effects. So in green, you could sort of see, well, there's the global effect. The unemployed are really largely because of disrupted trade ties, and that is largely an externality. So Australia would have been hit by an economic force no matter what it did, because a lot of our suppliers and customers would be too afraid to come and would have temporarily at least cut their ties with us. So that the green stuff is, as it were, the humanity's reaction as a whole. The red stuff is more, well, what you as a country could do. So business bankruptcies is very much up to local policies. Sectoral collapse is up to local policies. The civil wars are partly up to local policies, of course. Mass loneliness is very much something that you cause if you have lockdowns. The prevented IVF babies are very much something you cause if you sort of delay services or have them disrupted. The reduced usage of health services is also a local thing, and disrupted education is also a local. So there's a menu of things that sort of are very much in the laps of everybody in the world community for which you would want coordination, and there's a menu of things which you can choose on a running basis, and where hence a lot of the cost benefits of particular things you can do as a region will come to the fore. Now then, to the example cost benefit questions that I will talk about later are, of course, that you want to have the cost versus benefits of all large-scale reactions. And the nice thing about that, it's relatively easy to do. What if the world had just treated this as another flu season? And then you can talk about the economic collapse versus what was still expected in January, the social and emotional damage versus basically a flat line, no change, the death tolls of many events like famines versus no change from January. That's relatively easy to do. Suppose we as humanity had shrugged our shoulders at this, what were the costs and benefits? Then a much more difficult thing, which is much more relevant, of course, for individual governments. Well, what are the costs versus benefits of local government choices? Much harder, much less certain. That's about the additional economic costs of another month of lockdown, the main thing we'll look at. But you can also be interested in the emotional costs of track and trace versus do nothing. And such things need models. So local government choices, a good analysis of them always needs pretty strong assumptions of what you expect to happen if you go along with the policy choice you had that moment and then an alternative. That's always difficult, but we try. Now, what common metric? Cost-benefit analysis always needs a common metric to which everything is brought down. So apples and oranges and pears are brought down to a single metric. That's how cost effectiveness works. And traditionally, governments have relied on something like economic surplus. That is what is used at the moment by the Australian Treasury, New Zealand Treasury, the UK Treasury. Most treasuries worldwide use some notion of economic surplus and even bring human suffering and lives down to notions of economic surplus. And that's, for instance, where you will see these things like statistical values of lives used. A newer common metric is healthy years lived, which is basically the QALY approach, the quality of life years approach. And that has allowed individuals an easier and more sort of comprehensive notion of what changes have there been in mainly physical health, a little bit mental health, and to count that as well. So it's been used to sort of augment the economic surplus calculation. A new and preferred metric, for me at least, is the WELLBY, which is the happy years lived. And the advantage of going to the WELLBY is that it adds the things you can add together, basically. So you can then also look at lots of mental health things, you can look at loneliness, but also economic status, even things like freedom and the other things that the Australian Institute of Progress cares about can become part of a cost-benefit analysis. And otherwise, they basically are valued as nothing. Now, the basis of the QALY cost-benefit approach is essentially the government then maximizes some notion of the sum of the healthy years lived by the population. So some of the years lived by the population weighted by the health quality of those years. And there are lots and lots of subtleties when people actually do these calculations. And these calculations are done as a matter of course, thousands of times per month. There are whole businesses which do nothing else but do this and lots of government analysts. And the subtleties include, well, who do you count as part of the population? What's the discount rate for the future? What do you do with people who can't express themselves well, who can't answer questionnaires, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to talk about those, but we'll note that there is a large appendix. And for the case of WELLBYs, I've written that appendix, so we can talk about that at length if you want. And health quality, how do you know about health quality? Well, it's essentially judged by a questionnaire. It doesn't matter much whether you ask that in a survey or whether the physician asks it or the GP asks it. It's essentially subjective information on how people feel about their health. And the EQ5D are 5 subjective health questions. There are all kinds of variants of this. Some have much larger modules, but it comes down to asking people fairly subjective questions. That's what the QALY is based on. So that's about walking, washing, dressing yourself, whether you can do your usual activities, whether you're pain or discomfort, anxious or depressed. So that tells you what, as it were, the QALY approach is brought in, which is now routinely used in many Western countries, for instance, in the whole of Europe. The Euroqual is based on this, to assign health production. So we sort of make decisions about whom to treat and whom not to treat, partly on the basis of what is the expected bang for the buck in terms of the outcome to these questions. So it's primarily physical health, many variations and such. Now then the WELLBY, which is a relatively new thing, I coined that phrase, but there's now just been a report out by the sort of a British health group who've called the same thing the WALY. So the word has large public support and has sort of been brewing for many, many years. Then what the government maximizes is the sum of the years lived by the population, but it's now weighted by the well-being quality of those years. So, as it were, the happy years lived by the population. How do we measure well-being? We measure that by life satisfaction. So this is the individual evaluation of how they think they're going with life. And in calculations, you don't use the actual level that people put in, but predicted levels. You basically go to causal design studies as to how much does the population gain if there was this or that change. So what is the UK life satisfaction question? It's the first item of what is known as the ONS4. This has been mandated for almost 10 years now in every official survey. We have lots of information on this in the world. This thing is routinely asked of over 100 countries, thousands of respondents in each. This is now routinely asked in many companies, surveys, organization. It's sort of the front runner. So overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? 0 to 10. 0 is not at all, 10 is completely. And essentially, as a rule of thumb, you should know that a normal level for someone who is healthy is an 8. So that anchors you to the QALY. The level at which people are indifferent between living or not is sort of, at the moment, believed to be around 2, because that's what you get if people answer hypotheticals, whether they want to live on. The difference between an 8 and a 2 is 6. So a normal year of life is then worth 6 well-beings. And that is sort of a crucial thing, because all other influences on people's well-being can then be converted into years of life, and vice versa. So you can go back both ways, and you can put an awful lot of information about life satisfaction and what improves it in your calculations. And the great advantage of the well-being literature is that there are now over 100,000 studies from over 50 years that tell us an awful lot about the relative magnitudes of the influence of this or that. This is also a metric that people sort of roughly speaking vote for. If you ask people, what do you want for your grandchildren? This is roughly the best measure that comes around. So then this becomes the object of government policy. And as a rule of thumb, 1 QALY, so a healthy year of life, would roughly be worth 6 well-beings. And so the well-being sort of additionally captures everything that's important to people, and hence allows you to also put in your calculation, for instance, the loneliness that we now have by the lockdowns, which you wouldn't be able to capture with the QALY. So the QALY doesn't have that, and for instance, Mrs. Joy's status and things that give fulfillment, like our jobs. Now then looks at basic trade-offs, right? Some sort of sense, okay, how important are various things in terms of well-being QALY? Let's first look at, well, how deadly was this coronavirus for individuals, and then in particular, how many years of life have they lost? And this is a table which has been supplied by Andrew Briggs. He did this for the UK, and it's handy to read this table a little bit. Effectively, what Andrew does here is he sort of subdivides the population into age bands, and then he adds to that the distribution. Now, that's the distribution of people who died of the coronavirus. So this tells you that basically no one died below sort of the ages of 30. Then between the ages of 30 and 39, of the victims of the coronavirus, 1% were in that range. And so this tells you that almost 40%, 39% were in the range 80 to 90. And then we also know that the people who died of the coronavirus usually had existing health conditions. And health conditions are captured by SMR, which is basically some notion of the amount of health problems you already have before you caught the virus. And there's SMR1, which is basically sort of low levels of health problems, and up onto SMR3, which is higher levels of health problems. And really the thing you want to look at is the D-QALY thing. The D-QALY thing as well, okay, how many quality adjusted years of life have you lost if you die at that moment in that level of otherwise health state? And this, for instance, tells you that if you were 90 to 100 and you died, then you sort of have lost 1.9 healthy years of life. If you died and you had of the same age range, but you had more health problems, you would have lost 0.9 years of life. And so the bottom line here is that you're looking at the people with low health problems would have lost 6.15 on average, because you can use the distribution to weight it, up to 3. So roughly speaking, the number of quality adjusted years of life that people have lost who've died of the coronavirus in the UK is between 3 and 5. In Italy, it's probably a little bit less. And this is a crucial number, of course. So for instance, if you use estimates for how much a whole life is worth, 80 years, then this tells you that you should really only use 5% of those 80 years as a reasonable estimate for how long people still have to go. That's one crucial trade-off number. That sort of gets you onto, okay, what's the value of the people whom you are saving? It's basically 3 to 5 years of otherwise normal living. Now, the second crucial trade-off number that you need to know is, well, how many lives are saved in the long run if you keep up government expenditure via health expenditure, but also other expenditure? Now, you need that in order to link recessions to lives, quality adjusted years, and well-being. So this allows you to sort of add the recession to the health effects, direct health effects of the pandemic. Now, there are two and really three basic types of evidence. Fortunately, they all come to a very, very similar number, so I won't have to talk about them too long. One is you can look at the historical relationship between all kinds of government expenses and health life expenditure. So for instance, in 1850, life expectation was something like 45 years of age, even in Western countries, and now it's up to 80, 82, and Australia is particularly healthy, it's close to 83. And you can link those causally. So we, for instance, know that people live longer when there's sewage, when there's clean water, when inside houses they no longer cook with wood fires, but they cook with gas or electricity. Good nutrition helps, toilets help, GP systems help. Part of that benefit is via herd effect. Everybody benefits if everybody else around you is healthy because of the same thing. They no longer carry diseases, so you're no longer ill by them. And as a basic rule of thumb, if you sort of look at this economic historical health literature, you can think that an additional 10,000 in a gross domestic product by purchasing power parity, so this is sort of adjusted for price differences. If you start from 1,000 per person, you go up to 10,000. So this is the initial phase of economic development. China's been through that. India was at the middle of this. That buys you an additional 10 years of life. And that allows you to link GDP to years of life. And there are lots and lots of causal design studies which tell you that the steps along this way are pretty good. Now, the second type of evidence is that there are official numbers which particularly Western governments use as estimates for how much additional health expenditure buys, how much health additional expenditure in education, all kinds of things buy. And those numbers match up very closely. So let's use the second one because these are the official numbers also used in Australia. So I know this best in the UK, but also know this in Australia. In the UK, the government, for all its internal calculations, basically uses the rule of thumb that you can buy one QALY, quality adjusted years of life, which is 6 Welbys, for 15,000 UK pounds. That's 25,000 Australian dollars. That is the production cost of a QALY if they would spend more on health services, and hence also what they would lose if they spend less on health services. That's what operations, GP services, cancer treatments, that's the bang for the buck. Now, the number is not uncontested. Some say it's double that. Fine. Now, if we take the 15,000, then the production cost of a Welby should be set at 2,000, 5,000 pounds. That's been the recommendation of the government of a large report recently. And that would then be true for any program. You would basically want rationality across the whole of government. So that the normal year of life is generated at a cost of 15,000 pounds. Now, you can then use, of course, an alternative thing. You can have a high-end estimate of some cost of QALY, which, for instance, would cost the cost of marginal medicines. That would then be closer to 50,000 Australian dollars per regular year of life. That would be probably more familiar to most health economists in Australia. But one should bear in mind that that really only goes for a small part of the health expenditures, and that you're not looking at the average production costs, which are really the relevant one in here. Now, on average in the world as a whole, of course, they are only 1/3 as rich as we are in the West, so you should basically think that the effects there are 3 times larger of money. You can also have a further extreme value. You can have consumer willingness to pay for a QALY or a Welby. Then we're looking at almost 100,000 Australian dollars. That's sort of the maximum that we find in terms of willingness to pay, but then you use that for all of GDP, i.e. you then use that for the whole of the economic surplus. So that's roughly speaking the ballpark figure that we're talking about, between 25,000 Australian dollars and 100,000 Australian dollars per regular year of life lived. That's sort of the number that people have, and that's then used in cost-benefit analysis. That's the ballpark conversion numbers. And note that this is not, as it were, saying, well, you know, this is lives versus the economy. No, this is saying the economy generates lives via government expenditure. Government expenditure totally stops on health, on education, all other things. Well, we then go back to, the 14th century, and we would have lives measured in maybe 30 to 40 years of life expectancy. So you can really use this in order to sort of have a ballpark figure of how much the economic collapse has costed in terms of life. There's now 10 trillion Australian dollars less, right? And that is sort of expected for next year as a whole, for the world as a whole. We now basically think 8 trillion American dollars, 10 trillion Australian dollars. If that's less in economic activities, that would mean 4 trillion less in government expenditure, at least $1 trillion less in health expenses. The non-health expenses probably have an actual similar bang for the buck. So that's at least worth 40 million regular life years. So that's 40 million Kwali, 240 million Welby, and that is hence an enormous amount, right? That's equivalent to hence more than 10 million coronavirus deaths, who after all would only have 4 regular life years on average to live. So that gives you an enormous number as to the damage done to the human population, just in sheer lives that we will lose in the coming 10, 20 years because of what will come, which is austerity, reduced government expenses, because there's less to go around. And that's at the very minimum. If any of the expectations are true about the hunger that is coming, the loss of inoculations, the loss is going to be far, far, far bigger. Now, the initial and current estimate is that we will lose this just the next year alone. But of course, the year after that, the economy might go up, but it won't be back at the same levels. In terms of the status quo, what we have lost is easily something like 50 trillion. So 50 trillion means that really we should think about 40 to 67 million equivalent as COVID deaths as what we have done. Right? That's the ballpark figure. And bear in mind, the number of people who died of COVID is something like 320,000. So we are already incurring a loss that is easily something like 200 times larger that will come in the future via all these reduced government expenses. And it's very hard to get around that. Right? These are the official numbers used by governments, and it's the found productivity. This will come by, because there will be delays in clean water provisions in India. This will be because there will be now more famines in Africa. This will also be in our own countries because of deaths of despair, because of austerity measures, which there have been many books written on just how painful that is for us. Now then a third basic trade-off number, which is very, very important, which is, well, what is the cost of the social isolation? It's one of the strengths of the Welby is that you can look at this loneliness stuff. Now, there have been 2 recent studies in the UK which have really looked at, okay, the people who were forced to look down versus the people who still could go to work, and the people who could still go to work basically saw no real reduction in their well-being. Those who were forced into lockdown lost so much that on average the population as a whole lost about 0.5 Welby if you would have that for a whole year. Now, that is basically comes into line with the rest of the literature as to how important social relations are. This is forced loneliness. This is the effect of battered housewives who are now sitting at home with their abusers. This is people who are unhealthy or too afraid to go to hospital, the anxiety. And it captures a lot of, as it were, of the social unhappiness. Now, this number comes from the UK, so I'm going to presume it also would hold for Australia, although new numbers will quickly confirm whether that's true or not. That's coming. But if that's half a Welby per individual, that of course holds for the entire population. And furthermore, this is a number which you can turn off or on based on whether or not you're going to keep up social distancing. So per million inhabitants, this means that you're going to lose 500,000 Welbys per year. That's equivalent to 82,500 regular years of life lost per year. That's equivalent to 25 to 12,000 corona victims per year. That's 2,000 to 1,000 corona deaths per month. And that's per million. Australia has got something like 22 million individuals. So that means that there is an equivalent number of coronavirus deaths of 20,000 to 40,000 individuals per month in Australia, just because of the loneliness. And that hence comes from the Welby approach, which is that allows you to add up, as it were, all the suffering that is now happening of the millions of people forced home versus, of course, the suffering of people who would lose their lives and would hence have to forego the joy. So that is an enormous cost. Just as a ballpark figure, it sort of boggles you once you see these kind of things. You think, oh my God, this is way worse. Now, then a fourth trade-off number is the cost of unemployment. Unemployment comes with the sense that life is not worthwhile, anxiety, higher suicide rates, and the long-standing number in the Welby literature is that the unemployed themselves lose at least 0.7 Welby per year of unemployment, meaning that their life satisfaction is 0.7 lower. if they're unemployed for a whole year. That lots and lots of studies, causal design, plants who closed down, recessions, basically we keep coming up to that kind of number. The total effect, if you also count the unhappiness created by the rest of the family, the rest of the community, might well be 3 times more that, but let's take the conservative number. So for 1 million unemployed for 1 year, that loses you 700,000 Welby, and if you calculate that down, that tells you that's equivalent to between 1,700 and 3,400 corona deaths per month. A corona death for somebody who would otherwise live 4 good years. And that too can be proportionally attributed to lockdowns or other measures, depending on whether it extends the period of unemployment, it adds to it, or takes down from it. It's a basic number you can use in lots of your calculations. So, for instance, for the West as a whole and the whole of the world, we think there are now 400 million additional unemployed. Let's suppose they're only unemployed for a year, which is a very, very optimistic number, probably much more than that. Now, those 400 million additional unemployment years would be equivalent to 8 to 16 million corona victim deaths. So again, we get this huge ballpark number of the unhappiness we are going to create via the unemployment, which won't be unwound. And that's at the very minimum, probably 3 times higher than that. And this is a little graph that shows you, well, how can you calculate unemployment years? If you sort of have a peak, so there's been there's a big peak in the change in unemployment, so that we're up to more than 200 million. And then if you're very optimistic, you say, well, by March 2022, this is over. All these people have found jobs again. Very, very optimistic. You can have a more realistic scenario. You say, well, the peak is probably more like 400 million. That's counting people in Africa and Asia who are sort of not formally employed, but who now basically have no means of income. And then, well, suppose that's back March 2024. Even that is slightly optimistic. And then you can basically do a quick triangulation as to how many people involved in that. In the first one, there'd be an additional 200 million net unemployment years. In the second one, 800 million net unemployment years. And I must say, the second calculation is roughly what the IMF and other people are thinking. The left calculation is if you're being extremely optimistic. Now, those are some of the basic trade-off numbers from which really the rest sort of will flow. Right? There are many others we can measure. We can mention suicides, air pollution, battered housewife, postponed hospital operations, and people are starting to put numbers to these sort of things. And I just want to give one example of as it were, a number which is sort of hard to assign, which is IVF treatments. Right? We know the IVF treatments have been postponed because people are too afraid to go to the clinics. Also, the clinics have sort of stopped doing their operations. It's sort of not a very dangerous operation, so they could be restarted. So it depends on your type of lockdown. But really, everywhere in the West, most of the world, these treatments have stopped, and it takes a while to start them up again. And of course, the backlog won't be worked through because a lot of the people involved will by then be infertile, and there'll be new people coming through the system. So probably, as it were, babies you've lost. Now, Australia actually does a lot of IVF babies. There are over 13,000 per year. So per month, you're going to lose at least 1,000. In the UK, per month, you're going to lose at least 2,000. And these babies would live on average 80 years, not 4 years, 80 years. So that means that you're talking about 80,000 life years lost just via the IVF babies in Australia per month alone. And so, we're within this kind of thinking that what matters is each year of life and how it's lived. A baby who could live 80 years is basically worth between 16 and 27 coronavirus. So you get, again, this sort of huge number as to the loss you are creating by the lockdowns if it comes with these IVF things. Now, then, of course, you have to make a philosophical choice. Am I going to count them or not? Because, well, they don't yet exist. But on the other hand, we think of forced sterilization as something terrible on people, and this is sort of in between. You got to pick a number between 0 and 100% as to how much you care, but it won't be 0%. These are real lives and the joy they would have led to families, which count. Now, bringing it together, right? If we put all of humanity's correct reactions to COVID versus shrug shoulders, so that is, well, let's not look at Australia, the world as a whole. And the second analysis, we think, well, what about a month of sort of half lockdown? And I'll tell later what I mean by that. All of humanity's reaction, the potential benefit is between 0 and 1% of the world population. I think it's probably 0.05% of the world population because that's what Sweden is getting, and it's sort of getting herd immunity back for that, which means it's unlikely they'll have many more deaths in the future, and it's in fact quite likely that many European countries will adopt their style now, right? But one can also take a higher number, like 0.2 world mortality. That would basically be, as it were, New York, but a little bit worse everywhere in the world, even in places where this virus is hardly contagious. That would mean 50 million COVID deaths. So let's use that. Right? Note that that is a huge amount more than, of course, the 300,000, and there have been countries which have done very, very little. So let's count 60 million years of regular life saved. Let's take a high number as to how much we've saved, right? Which is 50 times the current world mortality. So in terms of any previous pandemic or the first wave actually had a lot of victims, this is being very generous towards what we possibly have been saving by all our actions now and in the future. Let's take 60 million years of regular life saved as what you could potentially have saved by lockdowns and all the other reactions. Well, then the cost, if you look at the economic collapse, you're looking at 5 billion well-being. If you're looking at the mental anguish of unemployment, 1.5 billion well-being. If you're looking at the loneliness and stress from the lockdown applied for, let's say, 2 months, 333 million well-being. So in total, you're quickly looking at 7 billion well-beings lost to our reaction. Now, if you apply the 7 billion well-being lost, which is where my mainstream estimate for what our total reaction has been, that would be equivalent to something like 300 million coronavirus deaths. Now, 300 million coronavirus deaths versus 15, well, that's a factor of 20. So quite simple ballpark figures tell you that the loss we have already incurred, which is no longer reversible, is already 20 times that what we could have, in a very generous scenario, been saving via lockdown. And that's not even counting the IVF baby cost, the health cost due to reduced services, disruption of education, I haven't even mentioned that, etc. And it could hence be as low as a minimum of 5 if I really pick all the assumptions to be as extreme as possible on the benefit side of lockdowns and minimum on the cost side, up to a factor of 100. Now, what about marginal policies in Australia then? Let's calculate something quite simple, which is effectively the ongoing costs of lockdown, which is, well, suppose we don't recover, but we don't make things worse either. So we're sort of in half social isolation. We keep the number of unemployed we have, but we don't reduce it. Neither do we increase it. So as it were, what are the running costs of maintaining the level of problems that we now have for ourselves? And let's do that per month. So a sort of a minimum lockdown kind of thing, which is, it may well be what happens if we get a second wave, for instance, right? So there's no reduction in employment, no recovery of GDP. It sort of all flat lines at the level that it is now, which seems to me an important one to ask. So it's sort of the cost of ongoing but not complete lockdowns. And you can then compare that yourself with what you think the benefits could be. Let's just look at the cost. So the cost of the loneliness and stress of now, let's apply to only half of the Australian population, that would be almost 500,000 well-being. The cost of the continued unemployment, that would be about 58,000 well-being. The cost of the IVF babies, 480,000 well-being. The cost of reduced government expenses proportional to the GDP loss, and the GDP loss is, of course, 20%. That's almost 6.7 billion. That's going to be 380,000 well-being. So this kind of running cost is going to be roughly equal to 1.4 billion well-being per month. And if you want to add things to that, you can calculate it yourself or sort of subtract things if you say, oh, I don't believe that, right? But that would hence be equivalent to 48,000 lives lost per month. That would be the ongoing cost. That's as it were, the ballpark figure for how bad the pandemic would have to be before this makes sense. And hence in a future would also be the kind of number that you'd have at the back of your mind. Well, okay, how dangerous must this thing be before I go towards these kind of lockdowns? Well, it must be as bad as losing almost 50,000 people per month, but it must be an ongoing loss, not just a one-off. It must be an ongoing loss because, of course, if one does this indefinitely, then one has to presume the benefits come indefinitely rather than a one-off. So it's the ongoing. Now, the benefits of the lockdown, if you think of, well, let's take a very low number. What if you're only saving 100 COVID deaths per month, which is, in fact, more than has been accrued by a place like Australia, but also similar to numbers in Indonesia and Malaysia, which, like Australia, have had very, very few deaths per million. Well, that would be 3,000 well-being you'd be saving. Let's be generous. Let's say you are saving 5,000 prevented deaths per month. You have to keep this up more than a year. So that would, you know, if you do that for 2 years, you're over 100,000 people that you're then saving, Well, that would be 150,000 well-being. and if you compare these benefits with the costs, then the cost versus the benefits range from a factor of 10 to 500, telling you that even on sort of generous assumptions as to how many people you're saving versus the cost that you are making by just maintaining the current status quo as to the level of damage we're doing to ourselves and our economy, that is how bad things are. So the conclusion is that this WELLBY approach, cost-benefit analysis, is sort of quite powerful because it allows you to add a lot of stuff together. Right? It allows you to add up apples and pears and oranges as well. You can add loneliness to death, government expenditures, and IVF babies. It all comes back into a common metric. Now, there's a huge literature to draw on as to these rough effects of circumstances. There's a lot of dross out there, but also some really solid stuff. So it's a powerful tool for when there are many conflicting effects and you're thinking, oh my God, how am I going to add all this together? You will have to, of course, make assumptions when you make scenarios. That's true for all decisions. And so I've outlined what seem to be some of the important. And it tells you that the implied costs of the reactions to COVID outweigh the benefits in any metric. Whether you want to look at happy lives lived, whether you want to look just at the number of people dying, whether you're looking at the healthy lives lived, whatever you want to look at, the cost for humanity as a whole is at least 10 to 20 times what the possible benefit could have been. And also by any metric, lives, health, and well-being, delaying recovery in Australia with continued lockdowns is going to have far higher costs than benefits, unless you want to go to some sort of extreme scenario. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Graham, you can unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Paul. It's very comprehensive. I did look at the slides before. I've now looked at them a second time, but my head's still spinning. So I don't know how other people are dealing with that. The question that comes to me in the first place is that I thought they were using the death rate as being somewhere around 1%. And you're using a 0.2% for deaths avoided. Can you reconcile that for me?
Yes. So you will note that in the later calculations, when I sort of give the sort of upper estimates of the number of deaths, I use things that are close to 1% if you sort of smear them out over several years. But I think the key information we now have is that it's not the case that the whole population would truly get ill if you don't, as it were, do lockdowns or you do some sort of smart trace or you do herd immunity. Right? We've learned from New York, from Sweden, from the whole of Europe, that there's nowhere near to 1% death that you're going to get. Even in the worst case scenario, there's that, as it were, you achieve a herd immunity with far less percentage deaths than that. So 1% happens is if you give everybody a syringe and you inject them with this virus, yes, then you might get 1%. That would be the caseload base. But it's not what you are likely to get when when you let this, as it were, develop a natural herd immunity. And the most interesting case there is Sweden, because Sweden now claims that 30 to 40% of its population in the major cities are immune. Right? And they do this at a current death toll of 0.035% of the population. 0.035% of the population. So they are close to herd immunity, they claim, with only 1/30 of that 1%. And hence, even in a place like New York, where basically this virus was left to roam before there was any reaction, you're still only talking about 1/8 of 1%. And that's in the worst case scenario of a very dense city where this virus easily infects everybody. So the cities in Australia are nowhere near that kind of setup. So the 1% is just no longer believable anymore. Now, of course, in the virology literature, there is this huge uncertainty as to how many people are, as it were, unseen carriers of this. And hence that makes it difficult to know what the actual mortality rate would be if you would, as it were, infect everybody with it to a high degree. But from the cross-country stuff, it just no longer seems reasonable to think that you're going to get close to 1%. Even 0.1% is no longer reasonable for a country as a whole.
Right. Okay. Now I'm going to give Brian Phillips the first question. Can you unmute? Brian, can you sent us the question, if you wouldn't mind reading out that question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me. Look, I asked this question, if governments have been made aware of all this data, and it's almost common sense that you're talking about, why have they proceeded down the path they have? Is it because of fear, or is it because of the epidemiologists, all of whom across the world are pretty well connected, who've scared the living daylights out of everybody with their excessive and very risk-averse estimations? I mean, why have they just about destroyed the world's economic fabric?
Brian, I think you come from the same place as me, so I think we're going to end up clearly agreeing. But when I asked myself this, and I was tearing my hair out 2 months ago when I sort of started thinking about this and saw this coming. I think it's a combination of factors. I think really there's been a world hysteria, which even without the epidemiologists, people really got scared. And here in the UK, I know that the newspapers were running stories every day, all of them. You know, all the pages were full of horror stories. And I think that a lot of the epidemiologists also got sucked in with this. So they sort of, you know, they lost their bottle. There were several epidemiologists who think very similar to how I think as to how one should handle these pandemics. And some of them were very senior and they were talking to governments. But because of this enormous fear, there were petitions of scientists saying, oh no, we must do the safe thing. And the safe thing seemed to be destroying the fabric of society, our economy, and bringing the health service to its knees the next 20 years. That was seen as the safe thing. There was this enormous pressure, and so the epidemiologists changed their models. They suddenly came up with much higher projections than they did even a week before, and they said, oh, this is because we've now looked at the Italian data, mumble. But I really think one should sort of put the blame for a next time on this hysteria, and then wonder, well, where did that come from, and how can we circumvent that? And I certainly see the hubris of the epidemiologists and, you know, their connectedness. I see that as a factor too, but I think the hysteria is really the thing that pushed it. And that's a very difficult thing. It's a crowd thing. I can't hear you. Graham must unmute you.
Hang on. Sorry about that. So, Paul, you said, you know, how do we stop it this happening again? Have you given it any thought?
Yes, I've written many, as it were, thoughts on this. So I asked myself several institutional questions for a next time round. And I think there's many things that we can do in terms of better advice to government. I think better advice to government needs a different setup of advisors, because it's very clear that the advisors they now had were experts in epidemiology and virology, but they weren't savvy economists. And I use the word savvy economists deliberately. These are the economists who would now be at the Reserve Bank, who would be here at the Bank of England. You want people like that in the room because they have an intuitive understanding of how you wreck the economic system. And to be honest, most academic economists are clueless about what would wreck the economic system. They really have no idea. But a sort of a bank economist would immediately recognize, oh, if all these countries are going to stop trading with each other, that's going to give us an enormous recession. They would immediately see that. But many academic economists wouldn't. And you also want people in there who know about the social system, who would immediately recognize, oh, if everybody's locked down, you're basically forcing individuals to become lonely, and would have an idea as to how important that loneliness is. And ditto for the unemployment. So you sort of want a different advice system, I think, around our Western governments, and that's sort of doable. But it does mean that one is actually...
What happened to the health economists who make the decisions in terms of where you direct money in the health system? Have they not made this decision making?
Totally missing in action. Totally missing in action. Totally missing in action. And it's for a good reason, Graham. I mean, there are two reasons. One is most health economists are not very good. A second reason is that most health economists are sort of advocates of medics rather than that they're economists. And so, you know, they look up to the medical profession and, oh, these virologists are published in the Lancet. Oh, well, then we must follow them on their policy advice. And this notion that, yes, they are the expert on the virus, but they're not the expert on policy, or what effects their things would have, their advice would have on the rest of society and the economy. They're total amateurs of that. Health economists, by and large, are not confident enough. So here in the UK, almost none of them have spoken out. I happen to have been in a meeting just this Tuesday last week with 25 health economists from around the world, and they're all mumbling similar things as I was saying. but none of them were dared to say it in the open, because this would go against, you know, the medics whom they look up to. And they weren't comfortable enough with all these various trade-offs around. So they were just not well trained enough to sort of be confident to speak about what the average effect would be if you take things into balance. So to be honest, they've been useless.
Right. Chris, we'll go to you for your question. You there, Chris?
Yep. Thanks, Graham. Look, I just can't help but think this is a problem for democracies. Our democracies with 24-hour news cycles and, you know, combative oppositions at a massive disadvantage. If you want to get re-elected, how do you not respond to this in a way that allays people's fears? Because the media really beats us up. You're talking about people being scared, Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have some sympathy with your question, and I think it hasn't helped. But in this case, I think the hysteria sort of was so large that it sort of didn't matter what kind of political system one was in. So it started in China, and the Chinese they're usually more pragmatic when it comes to this sort of stuff. But there too, the central politicians in Beijing felt forced to, you know, be seen to react very strongly to this virus and to have it in hand. And they've had exactly the same sort of economic collapse in their own country. And hence it's just empirically not true that, as it were, democracies are the only ones who are susceptible to this. It was such a huge hysteria. All politicians around the world have more or less followed in this enormous wave. There have been very few holdouts. I think there was the president of Tanzania or something who said, look, this is my policy. We're not going to talk about this. There's no real problem to be had. You know, God will sort it out for us. And I don't want any media stories about it. I think he's sort of been the only guy to hold out. But it's been too difficult for all kinds of politicians. And hence that goes to the question, well, how did this hysteria get to be so huge? You know, and there I look to social media and think, well, what can we do? And I puzzled for 2 months, but I haven't really got an answer how to prevent this huge wave of hysteria that went through the world's social media. I don't know.
Paul, sorry, just following up on that, Paul, is there a possibility that some of the hysteria is actually being fostered by some of the players? And I'll just instance China, in that while this pandemic's been going on, they've actually been making some quite serious military moves in the South China Sea. We've got this trade fight going on with Australia. Is it possible that some of the players actually are finding that the hysteria and the panic is to their advantage?
Well, if you sort of tally up the losses, I think China will come out of COVID corona as a loser, because it has totally locked down almost the whole country and might see itself forced to do so again. So it's had a huge economic cut. And relative to that, the United States, for all its failings, seem to have had less of an economic cut. They've sort of been in lockdown less long, and they're going to come out of it sooner. And if there's a second wave, they're bound to just ignore it. And so I think that paradoxically, the US has had a better coronavirus experience than China, and in that sense will sort of, you know, come out relatively better for it. And hence I think people look at the wrong thing, and the wrong statistics is the kind of thing. Right? The media keeps looking at these death statistics and doesn't put it into the context just how tiny they are relative to the huge losses that will come from the lost government revenue, the social isolation, the unemployment. They should look more at, okay, you know, how big is this economic collapse? Who is more likely to, as it were, rebound quicker, due to what circumstance? And they don't look at that at all. I mean, the media in that sense is such poor quality. I sometimes think this is just because journalists don't get paid enough, you know, the collapsing advertising. But that's a more difficult question. But no, I wouldn't say China's really benefited out of this. They've shot themselves in the foot as much as anybody else, if not more.
Okay, Rod, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Paul, I just want to know, do these models ever take into account all spending on health? You seem to mention throughout the presentation very specifically government spending on health. And the government aren't the only organisations that spend in health. And arguably sometimes when they do spend on health, it crowds out private spending in that area. So was that very deliberate that you said government spending, or was it both?
It was, because of course I'm much more familiar with government spending. I mean, I've been advising the UK government for now the last 3 years on all kinds of expenditure, including health expenditure. And in the UK, really, private health expenditure is very, very tiny, right? And it's also the better studies are involved in terms of government spending on health, which in most of the world is sort of the vast majority of sort of spending in this area. The US is an exception, but in the US we know that they actually get much less bang for the buck from their average health expense, because this is one of the areas whereby government is just far more efficient than the private health sector for various reasons. So I use it for government expenditure because that's the largest bulk of it. It's sort of well studied, and it's for the numbers which are sort of used internally in the bureaucracy. So it's, you know, something to point to. Now, yeah, let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that. One could indeed add all kinds of nuances, Rod. I mean, there's a lot further one can do. In order to get a ballpark figure, you sort of, you know, you take the big bulk of it and then apply the number which is most used for it, and then you sort of.
Okay, Tim Florin, Professor Tim Florin, you've got a question.
People hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Paul, I really enjoyed your talk, and I came to it with pretty much similar views, but I wanted to ask a question to really make a comment, because I wasn't able to make a comment without asking a question.
Watch yourself, I got the mute button.
Okay. I think you're undermining your argument a little bit by underplaying total case fatalities and the effect of the interventions. I agree with you that case fatality rate is quite low, and one of the reasons is because of interventions, not necessarily lockdown interventions. Another reason is because of the way we live. In Australia, for example, A, we had very few cases to start with, and B, we have, a lot of us are in gardens or in open air, whereas if you're in Holland or London, you're stuck in enclosed apartments, and you're much more likely to get large inoculums. You're less likely to evade that. So I suppose I'm just making the point that case fatality rate may be, say, 0.1%, but until herd immunity threshold is reached, there's going to be a lot more case fatalities. I kind of was interested that you thought Sweden was near herd immunity threshold. I've sort of done calculations, and I think they're not as close as, say, New York or even Germany. And that's just on calculations based on case fatalities so far, and then working back according to doubling times of the actual spread of the virus. And anyway, I'm all for what you're saying. I'm just thinking maybe we could tone down the extreme cost benefit seesaw, which is in one direction. You say 10 to 50 times or something like that. I think it's going to be more like 2 to 10 times, or depending on the country.
Well, let me react to that. I think, you know, the notion of 5,000 deaths per month, if one keeps this up, right, is actually being very generous to what lockdowns could potentially achieve in Australia. But I will agree with you that, as it were, the world of virology around this is massive, and it's got all kinds of stuff in it. I will point to two things why I do believe that the Sweden numbers are close to herd immunity. One is that these are their own estimates as to the percentage of the population that is now showing some kind of immunity to this. So the number of people with antibodies. And so they now think by the end of this month, they'll have close to 40% in Stockholm basically immune to this at a cost of 0.035. The second thing to say is that there's huge variation across countries as to these case fatalities because of who's been exposed. And a good case is the UK, which has many more fatalities per million than Sweden. because here they didn't manage to actually protect the retirement homes and the nursing homes and the hospitals. So many people picked it up there. And in a sort of bizarre twist, it seems like the lockdowns have actually caused deaths in a place like the UK, because it prevented, as it were, a first round of all the nurses and the people around these retirement and nursing homes to get it, stay away from the elderly and vulnerable, and then go back. But what has happened is they kept on having new people being infected who were then in these nursing and retirement homes. So paradoxically speaking, the most exposed and affected population were the most vulnerable part of the population, the wrong part of the population. And you see large differences in Europe, particularly on the basis of how well have they actually managed to protect that part of the population. And that had very little to do with lockdowns itself, and more around the things that they put in place for those vulnerable groups. And that's hence why I'm not too surprised at the Swedish numbers. But we can talk about this for a long, long time. There are many, many rounds on this issue. There's so much stuff coming out all the time.
Harriet, I think you wanted to ask a question.
Yes. Hi, Professor Freitas. So there is an argument that COVID has sparked an increase in productivity in innovation, especially in tech, coordination problems, network problems, all that can be solved by our technologies these days, as well as medical technologies in producing vaccines. It's a huge fracturing of the effects of this virus, because, as you said, some industries are, highly profitable and others are going out of business. So what do you think this increased productivity and innovation will have on our markets as a whole?
It's an interesting question. I mean, often in world wars or sort of crises, we see lots of new technologies who are suddenly given a chance, and that's sort of your kind of argument, which is that, disasters can in the long run be good for mankind. Right? I don't think that's very likely to be true for this one, though, because so many people are sitting at home and being unproductive, including a lot of sort of the high-skilled individuals. So whilst it's true that in some industries, this has been a breakthrough technology. For instance, the Zoom we are using now, I never used it, and now I've been using it for months for my students. But of course, the reality is that in lots of other areas, tech has stalled, right? It will have stalled in the automotive industry, in the airline industry, in the space industry, because those industries have all come to a grind. And so then I tend to look as an economist, okay, well, just how many people are now busy with tech? How many people are now, R&D? And well, lots of laboratories are closed down. Higher education is reducing in terms of its investment. So it's then hard to believe that, as it were, the world as a whole has really made this big push in technology. But it's ultimately an empirical question.
Okay, Don Woodrow.
Thanks, Graham. So you can hear me? I've just got off mute.
Yes.
Yep, great. So my question, Paul, was, do you see any signs that any government is actually starting to apply this more rounded or holistic analysis to making decisions, rather than what we've seen in terms of this narrow reaction based on particular epidemiologists' view of the situation?
Do you mean that in general, just the last 5 years, or do you mean now?
Well, in particular, in relation to, I guess, this event, which I guess is over a fairly short space of time, but are you seeing perhaps a growing appreciation that there may have been a skewed reaction to the event?
Yes. I will say the latter, but it's as Graham said to me when we were talking about this a few days ago. It's basically because they've come by it in an experiential way. So I think the Italians exemplify this. They almost invented the kind of lockdown that we now have many, many centuries ago. But the Italian minister said, look, we just can't afford to keep doing this. We have to open up. Whatever this virus does, there's just no way that we can suffer the debts, the unemployment, the misery. We just have to open up. And I think that is the way by which most governments will, as it were, get to a more holistic view, which is that the hurt and the other effects just make their presence felt on the political scene. They sort of become active. Business people push, central banks push, the unemployed, push, the tourism industry beckons, students push, the whole education sector pushes. And so to a certain extent, a similar thing comes not by analysis and sort of, rationally thinking, well, what are we losing? But more because of the losing interest groups, which then start to make a noise. And that's how it first starts. And then they will rationalize that and indeed sort of look for more broader analysis. But it seems to be pushed by interest groups.
Ben Beattie. Can you hear me, Ben?
Sorry, I was mucking around with my audio. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay,
Just
good.
leave the drum set alone.
yeah, wrong audience, this one. I was thinking about the conversation about the political reactions. And I guess my question goes to, for future pandemics, what's our situation going to look like? Are we still going to be beholden as voters to just people who are maybe their sense of right might not be aligned with ours? I mean, that's kind of why we vote for people, right? And they seem to have all the power, the politicians, and they look around to their advisors and their bureaucrats. But if they're not looking to their own internal checks and balances, do we just have to suck it up and accept that they're going to get it wrong sometimes?
Oh, geez, Ben.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think one way in which I now see this is that to a certain extent, this crisis is very atypical and has caught lots of societies unawares and unprepared for this kind of event. And so the systems that we have in place and the types of politicians and the things around them are set up for totally different challenges, right? They're set up for, well, how do I appear well, or the usual recessions, or fights with the unions or the opposition, or to sort of manage their media profile. And I think that governments, by and large, suddenly found them with a problem they had no idea how to understand, huge public pressures. And then, let's leave some experts in charge so that they can get the blame if things go wrong. And and so I think they've been very passive in this case. But the Chinese, who were less passive and sort of a very competent bunch, didn't have any different reactions. So I sort of am a little bit despondent about whether or not we'll make the same mistake. I don't think we'll make the same mistake the next 10 years, but in 50 years' time, yeah. Yeah.
Paul, just a thought. We're putting the blame on governments for creating this recession in reaction to an epidemic. But governments create recessions in other ways with monetary policy and sometimes with fiscal policy and so on. Should we be applying these kinds of metrics to economic management in general? And if we did, how much blame should politicians be bearing, and how should they be feeling about the fact that whatever they do, they're killing people?
Well, on the first question, definitely, yes. I think it would make for a more rational approach to government to try and bring everything to a common metric. It won't work in all areas. I mean, try and calculate the well-be benefits of the next submarine and you're going to struggle. And similar for things like the audit office is just going to be too hard. You're going to have to remain based on sort of rules of thumb and guesses. But yes, for lots of economic management, you would want to go to a more holistic view of government. And that's been sort of coming for the last 20 years. This well-be approach has sort of been in the pipeline and is now getting more intricate and boring and statistical and bureaucratic, as you could have seen. Then, will government still be blamed for making life and death decisions? Of course. That's their job. There's always going to be somebody blamed for the fact that money can only be spent once. And there's always going to be somebody who squeals that they don't get it. And tell you about all the dreadful things that will then happen. That's the hustle and bustle of the fight for power, Graham. I don't see that ending.
Okay, one last question from Bob Ransom. Hang on, it's not unmuted.
There, g'day. Paul, it seems to be the fact that the whole problem is private businesses are suffering, and the government bureaucrats and government are not losing anything at all. Their wages are still, they're still getting their wages, so it's falling back on the private section, isn't it?
I think the private sector has lost out big time, and I am very much in favor of a mixed system, because otherwise, there's going to be a total collapse of all the government system as well. We're not in a situation where we're going to have another Soviet Union. We need this mixed system. Without the private sector doing reasonably well, we're all stuffed. So I'm very much sympathetic to what you say. I think it's partly the case that the bureaucrats themselves don't sort of feel this pain, but I think it's more importantly, a large part of the population doesn't yet realize the deep shit they're in, right? I mean, where are the over 1 million people who are now de facto unemployed, who are sort of, getting sort of half wages by the government, who now realizes for the next 1 to 2 years, life is going to be pretty damn tough for them. I think that realization hasn't yet come in, and there is evidence for this, at least in the UK, whereby the same people who came up with these loneliness numbers also asked them, well, do you think you'll be equally well off next year financially as you were in the previous year? And something like 60% said yes. And it's insane. I mean, the number of people who are going to be financially worse off is going to be virtually everybody. I mean, even if you don't have a job, the property prices are not going to go up by what they previously were. Pensions for everybody are going to go down. I mean, there's no way you're going to escape this, impoverishment that we have in our society. And so it's also partially, as it were, the government bailouts and this mass borrowing, which the government is now doing, which is preventing populations from feeling the pain and hence making them feel, yeah, it's not so bad, actually. We can keep doing this for 5 years. And they don't realize, no, there's a bloody collapse already underway. And there's sort of, massive emergency borrowing that can't be kept up for very long, masking it. At a certain moment, the blindfolds have got to come off. And I've been amazed how long it takes.
Okay, I know I said that we have one last question, but in fact we've got one last question yet to go. Terry Geiger.
Hi, thanks, Graham. Paul, let's get down to the politics of this business. I'd reached a similar conclusion to yours in a very much less sophisticated way. I must admit it's been a revelation to me that there's some academic respectability behind the conclusion that I'd similarly reached personally. But when I tried to float it around my university, I'm a professor at Bond, people were sort of, it's a bit of a Pauline Hanson reaction, I agree with what you're saying, but for God's sake, don't say it in public. Very politically incorrect. The virtue signalers would be down on you like a ton of bricks. Nobody wanted to know. They agreed but didn't want to agree, thinking, hell, if I said this in public, the ABC would crucify me, blah, 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 blah. We really need to get this message out. Have you personally considered sort of approaching the Australian or someone to write a 15-year-old schoolboy sort of comprehensible version of this? And how can we get it around? I mean, I've already been making a list of all the people I want to send your slides to, if you don't mind your IP being invaded, to try and dissuade them. But it's a tough read, even for academics. It's a tougher read for the civilians. How can we get the message out? I agree with you entirely, and I feel very happy about having heard you say it in terms that are academically respectable. Would you like to comment on that? Are you going to write an article for the Australian, for heaven's sake?
Well, I have been in contact with Adam Crichton, who sort of thinks very similar to us, and who is trying to make the translation, as you say, right? I'm also very close to Gigi Foster, who's also a much better communicator to the general public than I am. I'm just not particularly good at that. And I agree with you totally about the political incorrectness and about the virtue signaling crowd. And it's been amazing to me how many of my economic colleagues who I thought were sort of living and breathing trade-offs have suddenly become total blinkered, right? As if there are no trade-offs in life, as if it doesn't matter that government is going to have to be austere for the next 20 years, that unemployment is unimportant for health. It's been a revelation to me how much stuck in the ivory tower the vast majority of academics were, and how little tethered to reality and real problems that they are, which leads them to this virtue signaling. You know, if you're sort of useless every day and then a crisis comes along, all you do is just you run along. Now, to be blunt, in order to bring this message out, we need help, right? I mean, I have particular strengths and weaknesses, as do others. I think that everybody who's concerned like you, that's right, should, in their own way, think, well, how can I help bring out the message? And yes, you can do whatever you want with my material. It's public IP. You can do with it whatever you want. Translate it. I've been trying. I've been talking to the Belgian media. I've been talking to the Australian media. I've been trying to push this out in Britain. There have been copycats here in Britain who's basically taken my ideas but put it in a way that's more politically palatable. Fine. Everybody who's equally bothered as yourself and myself, yeah, go with it. Run with it, please.
Well, one of the intentions of doing this series of seminars is to get these ideas out there. We intend to put it up on YouTube and also on our Facebook site. And we're also going to have a transcript done of everything that's been said. So, and I've been listening as you've gone along and thought, oh, there's a bit there that might work in a journalistic sense. So, you know, I think there's things we can do with sessions like this. And Paul, it sounds like you'd be open to doing other things that got publicity. So anyone who's in the audience here tonight and who agrees should be thinking about how you can get the message out.
Totally, and thank you very much for the invite. I think this is, you know, one of the few times when really there was something to choose for the public and the politicians, which is of real importance. And so, you know, it's about time we started choosing the right things.